Comic artists create depth within panels in various different ways, right? From color holds to vanishing points, there's a range of different techniques to make a panel feel like a window of a world that we're kind of looking into. Taiyo Matsumoto's work in the rather stunning Ping Pong gives us something else, however. Instead of reaching into the panels, often it feels like elements of the panels are reaching out towards us. Matsumoto appears to kind of mimic a filmic technique to create this distorted exaggeration in certain moments. So in this episode, I want to take a look at a few examples of this, what it seems to be doing, why it veers nowhere near close to being gimmicky, and why I just absolutely fell in love with it when reading Ping Pong. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So Ping Pong is, as the name might give away, a story about a ping pong club and specifically its cast of characters as they progress through tournaments and life. It's a sports manga, but as many of the best do, it focuses in on character interaction. What really blew me away, however, is that technique I talked about at the top of the episode, Matsumoto's use of these very interesting exaggerated images, where it almost looks like we're seeing a panel through a fisheye lens of a camera. Take this example early on in the first volume, where we have a character in the panel composed of a low angle, their body and arm bulging out towards the bottom of the panel, where the imaginary camera might be placed for this image. The third panel of this page has an equally interesting example, where the outstretched arm holding the ping pong bat also has a distorted presentation. You can see on the bat specifically how the shape here becomes more of a triangular one, compared to the rounded square we've seen a few pages before. And so therefore there is a distortion being applied to the presentation of the image. You can place things closer to the reader without that distortion, as Matsumoto does in many different occasions, but placing the distortion implies a different reasoning, a different rationale, and a different effect. And that distortion is so interesting, because it is a choice being made. Not every image has that same approach, and indeed the moments that we might specifically just expect to have that distortion, they often don't. I'm thinking of the likely time you maybe want to exaggerate a certain movement, for example in the middle of one of the intense ping pong matches. There's an example here where this fractured image instead is presented fairly evenly. Even when the image is close, like the character's face here, it contains none of that sort of, in air quotes, lens distortion. However, there are moments that we do get it, such as this one we saw earlier. Look at the extreme sizing of the hand on the right side, and how small the table looks in the background in contrast to the figure and that huge leering arm. It's combined with a really clever panel shape, which condenses on the right side and when the exaggeration occurs, helping to kind of additionally create further scale in that arm, right? It's massive within the confines of the panel, which gets smaller to make that look even bigger. And to answer why I think this is interesting, and why for me it works incredibly effectively, we have to kind of think about what it's trying to emulate. The likely comparison here for me is that fisheye lens I talked about, which warps the edges of the frames that it looks at, and it makes whatever is closest to the lens in the middle become exaggerated. Because it's such an extreme wide angle from a fixed point, it creates this kind of bulbous distortion. What is closer to the camera becomes almost bulging because of that. It creates both the implication of a physical presence, but also, more interestingly, the ability to have a different dimension to the usual effect of a window into the world. That extreme distortion, to me, really creates the impression that something is coming out of the image towards me, in a way that's really, really different than just, say, overlapping a panel edge. It creates a depth in a two-dimensional page, but not necessarily in three-dimensional space when you overlap like that. Arguably, what Matsumoto has created here in these moments is three-dimensional comics on a two-dimensional surface. The imagery is relating to something in physical space that doesn't exist. So what does that do? What does that give us? Well, let's take a moment here, which is fairly normal. A character has just read something in the magazine and is calling out to the others to come and read the news. Matsumoto frames the image looking down at the character as they lean sort of towards us, so obviously the head would be closest to the, imaginary camera, and as such the body is distorted. The head and shoulders are much larger in the moment than anything else, the character essentially kind of peering out from the panel. In a moment of normality, we are drawn into this image because the character reaches out to us. Take this example a little later, where we look up to this character that comes into the world. Again, the form takes this triangular appearance. The point furthest away from the air quotes camera is smaller and the wide base near the lens reaches out. It's much more than just looking up at the character, which you can do without this distortion, but it's creating this almost mythical viewpoint. The distortion is, for a singular moment, exaggerating our impression of this young man, and the effect of the low angle to make him look heroic is doubled down upon with the extreme rendering of it. And that to me is really the secret of why this works. The looming reaching out of the panel, the exaggeration both in the ping pong matches and outside of them, all works to heighten moments that are already attempting to be heightened. The moments are composed in a way to create tension already. A character staring straight at the reader as they rear back to hit a ping pong ball, the panel sliding to create a sense of movement and momentum, and Matsumoto adds in a foreground exaggeration, as though we're right there, we're right up against the character, up against this moment, right in the middle of the action, further pulling us in beyond just the composition. It elevates this moment further, it's like the Spinal Tap gag of turning the dial up to 11. And outside of the action, it does the exact same thing. It takes the purpose of the panel, like this moment of a character taking on responsibility as the perceived hero, and it exaggerates that to the extreme. The thumb pointing to them becomes bulbous as it reaches out of the panel to further draw attention to the moment, an inset panel that hides itself in stylistic approach. And even though this is something that Matsumoto uses a lot, it's not the default approach of Matsumoto, but it appears frequently enough to just become one of the many tools that he uses. And what's interesting about that to me is it never dampens the power. We are seeing distortion specifically on human characters, something we understand ourselves quite deeply, and so no matter how frequently you employ that distortion, it's never not noticeable. For example, you could argue that the lack of, say, halftones in this series becomes a part of its texture to the point it's almost invisible a few chapters in. It may not be something that you actively notice in the series, and that's something that we talk about in Strip Panel Naked a lot, right? Setting a kind of normal through constant usage and then being able to break that. However, never did I not become aware of these extreme exaggerations because they apply specifically to the human form. It's this really rather fascinating thing that both initially draws attention to itself on first reading as, something entirely different, and then chapter after chapter after chapter, it just becomes part of the texture of the work because of its frequent usage, and yet it just never loses its effect, which you would expect it to do of the way it's used so frequently. This is at odds with what we're so often taught about overusing a particular effect, kind of dampening its power. But I think here that power lies in the extreme distortion of specifically human figures. That's often our grounding as it relates to a story, and there's a humanity we recognise even in basic simplified drawing, to use the Scott McCloud example of a really minimised rendered face. And yet Matsumoto proves that as long as the distortion is centred on the human form, it never seems to be really any less impactful. And this is an extension of Matsumoto's kind of interesting approach to drawing in the first place. A lot of his forms are caricatured and rely heavily on the shape and form itself. And so that distortion is not something that is necessarily outside of the realm of what he's doing in panels that are not distorted. And this is what I think is so interesting about reading Ping Pong, is seeing those moments of exaggerated distortion and accepting them within the texture of the work because of the style that Matsumoto employs normally, but also still being something beyond the norm. And so the takeaway for me is to think about the direction an artist brings to their work through their own style naturally, and how they can distort and tweak that to a kind of abstract, almost surrealist look, while still remaining grounded within their own work. And that's not an easy thing to do by any means, but I think if you want to get an example of how an artist takes their own style, exaggerates it beyond the bounds of normality, but not outside of the bounds of their own artwork, your first port of call absolutely should be Taiyo Matsumoto and his work in Ping Pong. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Panel Naked, the series continues thanks to our amazing patrons. You can support the channel over at patreon.com/strippanelnaked, and in return, you'll get access to over 4 years of exclusive writing, annotated pages from comics, and reading lists that you can't see anywhere else. You'll also get a discount, or if you're a top tier patron, you'll get a free copy of the magazine that I edit, the Eisner-winning Panel by Panel magazine. Every month in that magazine, we get the very best critics and the very best creators to look in depth at the medium and discuss why comics are such an exciting form to tell stories in. If you like Strip Panel Naked, you like what we do on the channel, you will love Panel by Panel. You can also follow me on Twitter at HassanOE, and of course, hit subscribe and that notification bell right here on YouTube to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I will see you next time.